Today, I'm announcing a comprehensive new approach to make Canada the world's leading energy superpower.
Behind schedule and tens of billions of dollars over budget, but oil is now flowing through the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion.
Canada just pulled the plug, and the U.S. might pay the price at the pump. Canada has just made a bold move, rerouting 900,000 barrels of oil per day to Asia. And now, the big question is, can the U.S. handle gas prices soaring to $4 a gallon? For decades, Canadian oil flowed freely to the U.S., serving as a stable and friendly energy source. But that era may be over. With the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion set to be completed in 2025, Canada is preparing to redirect nearly 1 million barrels of oil daily, not to the U.S., but to Asia, especially markets in China, Japan, and India. This isn't just a logistical shift. It's a major shakeup in the global oil game, one that leaves the U.S. behind. Canada is no longer playing the role of the quiet, cooperative neighbor. It's stepping into a new role, strategic competitor. As this pipeline starts pumping, the U.S. could lose up to 61% of its Canadian oil imports. That's a major hit, and Americans will feel it where it hurts, at the gas station. By fall 2025, gas prices are expected to hit $4 a gallon. Picture this. You're at the pump, filling your tank, and suddenly you're paying way more than you did last week. That's not a far-off scenario. It's the near future. Refineries along the Gulf Coast, which rely heavily on Canadian heavy crude, will be hit hard. Not only will fuel prices rise, but disruptions in production could ripple across the economy, impacting transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, and millions of workers in the energy sector. Canada isn't just redirecting oil, it's redefining the rules of global energy. By locking in long-term contracts with booming Asian economies, it's gaining not just revenue, but serious geopolitical leverage. While the US has been focused on imposing tariffs and tightening policies, Canada has been quietly building powerful trade ties with the East. And now, Canada is cashing in. Meanwhile, the US finds itself in a tough spot. Watching a once reliable partner pivot away and toward rivals like China is a harsh wake-up call. If the US responds with more tariffs or sanctions instead of cooperation, it could push both economies toward a damaging trade war. That would mean higher prices, deeper shortages, and even more instability. America's energy producers would face supply gaps. Consumers would be stuck with skyrocketing costs. Industries like shipping, food production, and manufacturing would feel the squeeze. This could all snowball into a full-blown energy crisis. Here's the kicker. The rest of the world won't just watch. Countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran will likely move in, trying to fill the gap and gain market share. But can they compete with China's growing dominance in the global oil market? That's the big unknown. So what's next for the US? It may be forced to rethink its energy strategy, seeking new sources or boosting domestic production. But the question remains, can it pivot fast enough to avoid serious economic pain? Who would have thought Canada, the land of maple syrup, moose, and polite apologies, would turn around and say, "No thanks, America," when it comes to oil exports? But here we are. Let's put it in perspective. About 60% of US oil imports come from Canada, roughly 4 million barrels every single day. That oil, which is heavier and thicker than others, is perfect for US refineries, especially on the Gulf Coast. You could say America sips Canadian oil like it's morning coffee. But now, Canada's tired of being the quiet, loyal partner. It's making moves on Europe too, signaling that the US might not be the only one losing favor. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith isn't mincing words. If the US continues to play hardball, Canada will start shipping oil to Europe. Her message? Let's see how long you last without us. Alberta currently sends 700,000 barrels a day to the US Gulf Coast. That oil powers the US refining machine like Red Bull. Cut that off? The US might be stuck sourcing oil from Venezuela, and we all know how that ends. Despite what politicians say, the US isn't fully energy independent. It still depends heavily on Canadian oil. If that supply gets cut or reduced, gas prices could spike by 20 to 40 cents per gallon, especially in areas like New England. And it's not just oil. Canada also supplies the US with electricity, over 11,000 gigawatt hours a year. Replacing that would mean relying on slower alternatives or hoping Elon Musk finds a way to generate power from brainwaves. At the end of the day, this isn't just an oil story. It's a story about shifting alliances, economic strategy, and global influence. Canada is playing the long game. The US now has a choice: adapt or fall further behind in the new energy era. Oil, tariffs, and tension. Canada just made its move, and the US might regret it. When it comes to oil and energy, what we're seeing right now is a full-blown tit-for-tat between the US and Canada. It all started with Trump bringing back tariffs on Canadian steel, dairy, and cars. Canada, they fired back with a classic. All right then, we'll target your ethanol. Now that might sound small, but it's not. US ethanol, as common as memes about Trump, is a lifeline for American farmers. And Canada, they've been buying it up like hotcakes to power their clean energy goals. If they stop, farmers in states like Iowa could take a major financial hit. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Europe, freshly single after a very public energy breakup with Russia, is desperate for a reliable new partner. And guess who shows up, looking sharp and holding CETA and a few million barrels of oil? Yep, Canada. In March 2025 alone, Canada exported 8 million barrels of oil to the EU, double the amount from the previous quarter. Is this a real relationship, or just a rebound after Europe's messy split with Putin? Time will tell. But one thing is clear, Canada isn't just the friendly neighbor anymore. It's stepping up in a major way on the global energy stage. And oil is just the beginning. Canada's energy package now includes uranium for clean nuclear, critical minerals for electric vehicles, and clean electricity exports to help power the US grid. Canada isn't just selling fuel, it's selling influence. In a world racing toward clean energy, Canada is positioning itself as the Switzerland of power, neutral, essential, and quietly dominant. So here's the million-dollar question. If Canada really breaks from the US, will America come crawling back? Or go courting new partners like Venezuela? Either way, hold on to the gas pump. This energy storm is just getting started. Canada plus China equals a game changer. For years, the US was the main buyer of Canada's energy. In 2024, 97% of Canada's energy exports went to the US, totaling 176 billion Canadian dollars. But things are shifting, and fast. Shortly after the US floated a 10% tariff on Canadian oil and gas, China saw its chance. A major Chinese refining company, Rongsheng Petrochemical, moved quickly. With a daily processing capacity of 800,000 barrels, they opened an office in Calgary, Alberta, Canada's energy heartland. Soon after, they signed a deal with Suncor, one of Canada's biggest energy firms. The first shipments to China are already scheduled, starting June 2024. And this is just the beginning. Rongsheng is actively negotiating with other big names like Cenovus, Shell, BP, and ConocoPhillips. They're favoring FOB, free onboard deals, meaning they can change the oil's final destination mid-shipment. That flexibility? It's a huge advantage in the global energy game. Behind this shift is a seasoned strategist named Wang Jia, the founder of ProChina's energy trading division. And thanks to new infrastructure, the door is wide open. TMX, the pipeline that changed everything. The game changer in all this, the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX project, completed in early 2024. This massive pipeline now stretches nearly 1,200 kilometers across Canada and triples the flow of oil from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. Before TMX, Canada had to send oil through the US to reach global markets. Not anymore. Now, Canadian crude can reach Pacific ports directly, bypassing the US entirely. That puts refineries in China, Japan, and South Korea, who are specifically designed to process heavy crude, within direct reach. For the first time, Canada isn't stuck relying on US infrastructure or policy. TMX wasn't just built for efficiency, It was built for independence. And the moment US tariffs were proposed, Canada didn't hesitate. They responded with a $6.5 billion support package to help businesses pivot toward global markets. And they did. The second wave, natural gas. The energy shift doesn't end with oil. Canada is preparing to export liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Asia too. The LNG Canada project, located in Kitimat, British Columbia, and backed by Shell, ProChina, and Mitsubishi, is on track for exports by the end of 2025. Right now, Canada sends around 8.6 billion cubic feet of gas per day, mostly to the US. But soon, with new LNG terminals on both the Pacific and even the Arctic coast, Canada is paving a new, independent path to Asia. With oil and gas heading east, Canada is no longer knocking on America's door. It's building its own entrance and inviting global players in. The US-Canada relationship on the rocks. All of this is unfolding just months after the US presidential election, and the tone between the two allies has never been frostier. Over 90% of Canadians now say they want to reduce their trade dependence on the United States. Why? One statement from Trump was enough to tip the balance. As Washington ramped up protectionist policies, Canada quietly rewrote its trade strategy. The CETA agreement with the European Union was expanded almost overnight. New pipelines opened. Global contracts were signed. While the US was focused on taxing, Canada was building bridges to Asia, Europe, and beyond. A new global energy leader. The truth is, Canada isn't just an oil exporter anymore. It's becoming a strategic powerhouse in energy, rare minerals, electricity, and clean fuels. The infrastructure is in place. The contracts are signed. The allies are shifting. As the world moves away from fossil fuels, Canada is staying ahead of the curve, balancing old-school energy dominance with new-age sustainability. It's gone from being America's energy sidekick to a full-on global player. And as that transformation accelerates, the US has a decision to make. Try to repair the relationship, or get left behind in the new energy order. Canada breaks free, a quiet revolution that could reshape North America. Bilateral trade between Canada and the US has long been the backbone of their economic relationship, but that foundation is cracking fast. In just a short span, trade with Europe has surged by 65%, and a wave of capital, technology, and resources has flowed away from the US and into European markets. And Canada isn't stopping there. Canadian trade delegations have been showing up all across Southeast Asia, from Indonesia and Singapore to Ecuador, Australia, and Brunei. The mission? Bold and clear. Increase non-US exports by 50% by the end of 2025. What does this all mean? It means Canada, once tightly bound to the US economy, is actively dismantling its dependence. And it's not just talk. Canadian provinces are now leading a coordinated campaign to phase out US goods and influence from their economies. Provinces push back. British Columbia took the first big swing. It banned imports of key US agricultural goods like milk, chicken, and wine. Border inspections for US trucks were tightened, triggering supply chain disruptions. Quebec quickly followed, freezing all infrastructure contracts involving American firms. A massive campaign called Fabric of Quebec urged citizens to buy only local products, backed by direct government subsidies. Manitoba and Nova Scotia took things even further, requiring hospitals, schools, and government offices to remove US-made goods from all public purchasing lists. The result? Familiar American brands like Starbucks, McDonald's, and Apple began vanishing from government-run institutions. A historic election. Canada draws a line. April 28, 2025, marked a historic emergency general election, organized at record speed. It wasn't just a vote, it was a defining moment in Canadian identity. Newly elected Prime Minister Mark Carney wasted no time. In his victory speech, he declared, "We've eliminated the carbon tax for consumers, small businesses, and farmers to end the division it caused, because we are stronger together." Carney, representing the Liberal Party, took a firm stand. Canada will never be part of America, in any way, shape, or form. Even Pierre Poilievre, the conservative leader often compared to Trump, rejected the idea of annexation. He called it absurd and offensive, and proposed strong countermeasures focused on cutting spending and ramping up domestic production. Jagmeet Singh of the New Democratic Party went a step further, calling for banning Trump from attending the G7 summit in Alberta and demanding a halt on the export of strategic minerals to the US, directly threatening its tech and defense industries. From anger to action, a movement is born. The Canadian public didn't just watch, they acted. At festivals and sports events, the US national anthem was booed. American flags were turned away or taken down. What started as symbolic resistance has grown into a massive social movement. Canada is sending a message loud and clear. We're not the junior partner anymore. We want respect, not pressure. Keystone XL, a plot twist from Trump. Donald Trump once famously said the US didn't need Canadian oil, but after being re-elected, he shocked many by pushing to revive the Keystone XL pipeline, a project cancelled on Biden's first day in office due to environmental concerns. Why the sudden change of heart? Trump now argues that restarting Keystone is key to US energy independence and reducing reliance on OPEC nations. He called Biden's original decision devastating and demanded immediate action to resume construction. There's a reason this matters. Canada supplies about 60% of all crude oil the US imports, more than 4 million barrels a day. Much of that is heavy crude, which fits perfectly with US refineries, especially those on the Gulf Coast. The environmental divide. While Trump and energy companies argue that Keystone will bring jobs and stability, critics, especially environmental groups and indigenous communities, warn of devastating consequences. Extracting oil from Alberta's oil sands emits up to 81% more greenhouse gases than conventional oil. It poses a direct threat to US climate goals, particularly the aim to cut emissions by 50% by 2030 under the Paris Agreement. Indigenous communities are also pushing back hard. The pipeline route runs through sacred lands and sensitive ecosystems, including the Nebraska Sandhills, an area critical to water resources. These groups argue that the project violates their rights and endangers their land, culture, and heritage. A bigger picture. This isn't just about one pipeline. This is about the rebalancing of power in North America and the world. Canada is actively redefining its economic destiny. With projects like the Trans Mountain Expansion and LNG Canada, it's turning its focus toward Asia and Europe, stepping onto the world stage as a major energy and trade power. Meanwhile, the US, once the center of Canada's trade orbit, is now facing an uncomfortable reality. It might have taken its northern neighbor for granted. If Washington wants to rebuild that relationship, it may need a new strategy, one based on partnership, not pressure. Canada's bold breakaway, trade, energy, and a new era of independence. I just wanted a better future for my family. After we had our little boy, we dreamed of a life built on stability and opportunity, but all that was taken away, with just one signature. That's how one Canadian family described the emotional impact of a decision that's now setting off shockwaves across North America. The future? Uncertain. It's hard to plan when an administration seems set on crushing that future. As the US looks to revive the Keystone XL pipeline, indigenous communities are pushing back, filing lawsuits to protect their land, their rights, and the environment. Their argument is clear. The pipeline violates long-standing land and resource agreements and ignores indigenous voices, voices that were never consulted in the planning process. They also warn that this project could escalate discrimination and deepen existing social challenges. While Keystone XL might offer some short-term economic gain, the environmental and human costs are real and rising. As the world shifts toward renewables, doubling down on oil is starting to look like a step in the wrong direction. Canada's border pushback and the growing boycott of US goods. The signs of change are everywhere. In February 2025, 500,000 Canadians stopped crossing the US border. Tourism numbers dropped to their lowest level since the 2022 pandemic. But it's not just travel. Across Canada, American products are being boycotted on a massive scale. So what's behind this shift? And what does it mean for the future of US-Canada relations? Trump and Canadian politics. Stirring the fire. In a rare and controversial move, Donald Trump recently commented on Canadian politics, saying he'd prefer working with Canada's current government over Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. That one comment was enough to spark a political firestorm across Canada. Why now? Why weigh in? This is one of the few times a former US president has openly tried to influence another country's internal politics, and it could change everything. Tensions are rising, and US-Canada relations are entering uncharted waters. The numbers don't lie. Canadians are pulling back. For years, Canada has been a key market for US goods, travel, and tourism, especially in border states like New York, Michigan, and Washington. But that tide is turning. According to US Customs and Border Protection, 2.2 million Canadian travelers entered the US in February 2024, 500,000 fewer than the same time last year. It's the lowest border traffic since the height of the pandemic. At the same time, sales of American products in Canada have dropped 6%, while demand for Canadian-made goods is soaring. The reasons are both emotional and strategic. The tariff trigger, a turning point. On February 1st, 2024, the US announced a new round of tariffs on Canadian goods, set to take effect April 2nd. The impact? Canadian products will become more expensive in the US, threatening the competitiveness of industries like agriculture and manufacturing. The Canadian government responded swiftly. Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly issued a firm statement. No matter what happens in the US election, Canada will protect our economy and our jobs. But perhaps the most powerful reaction came not from officials, but from Canadian consumers. They started cutting back spending at US chains, and domestic businesses saw a sharp uptick in sales. This isn't just economic, it's personal. Beyond trade, military independence in the making. This shift isn't just about products on store shelves. Canada is now exploring military independence from the US. Talks are underway between Canada and the European Union to create alternative defense arrangements. One of the biggest surprises? Canada is considering scrapping its deal to purchase American F-35 fighter jets, opting instead for Sweden's Gripen jets made by Saab. Why? Because US trade policies are unpredictable. Canada is realizing that relying on American defense infrastructure is a strategic risk. Closer ties with Europe could open new doors for innovation, stability, and sovereignty. Key takeaways: the US-Canada relationship is changing fast. Trump's unexpected remarks on Canadian politics may shake up diplomatic ties. 500,000 fewer Canadians are crossing the border into the US. Sales of American goods in Canada are down 6%, while local businesses thrive. The US imposed new tariffs on Canadian imports effective April 2nd. Canada is exploring defense partnerships with the EU and possibly dropping US fighter jets for Sweden's. But perhaps the biggest question is, are we witnessing the start of a new era in US-Canada relations? OPEC sends shockwaves. Is the US oil industry in trouble? Adding fuel to the fire, OPEC just made a bold move, cutting oil production. The result? Prices are rising fast, and the US oil industry is feeling the pressure. Could this be the end of US dominance in the global energy market? OPEC has always used production cuts to control global prices, but this time, the consequences could be more severe, especially as global demand shifts, climate goals tighten, and Canada rewrites the rules of energy trade. What comes next? Canada is no longer quietly playing second fiddle. It's becoming a key global player, economically, politically, and strategically. From cutting ties with US energy pipelines to building deeper trade routes with Europe and Asia, this is a country in transformation. And if the US wants to keep its neighbor close, it may need a new approach, one based on partnership, not pressure. So, is this just a temporary storm? or the start of a new era? Stay tuned. There's much more to unfold. OPEC's bold move and the global energy domino effect OPEC is once again showing its strength as a market leader, cutting oil production to drive prices up. But this isn't just about balancing supply and demand. It's a calculated strategy to protect the interests of the world's biggest oil-producing nations. The ripple effect on the US and the global economy. When oil prices go up, everything gets more expensive, from the cost of producing goods to transporting them. That hits consumers and businesses hard, fueling inflation and straining household budgets. Some experts warn that if OPEC keeps pushing prices higher, the world could be headed for another economic downturn. So how does the US respond to this mounting pressure? America fights back with shale oil, but is it enough? To counter OPEC's influence, the US is ramping up shale oil production. In December 2024, US output hit a record 13.49 million barrels per day. The plan is simple: reduce dependence on foreign oil by tapping into domestic shale reserves. But there's a catch. Shale oil is much more expensive to extract than conventional crude. If global prices drop again, shale operations could become unprofitable, threatening the very strategy meant to protect US energy independence. Funding, regulations, and environmental pressures. The shale industry isn't just facing financial hurdles. It's under pressure from tightening environmental standards and ESG environmental, social governance policies. Many major investors are pulling back from fossil fuels and shifting toward clean energy projects. With stricter environmental regulations and a shift in the investment climate, oil producers are finding it harder to secure the funding they need to grow. So the big question remains: can the US maintain its shale boom if prices dip and funding dries up? A new threat to oil: the rise of electric vehicles. But OPEC isn't the only challenge oil producers face. The electric vehicle, EV revolution, is changing everything. By 2025, over 20 million EVs are expected to be sold globally. Countries around the world are setting aggressive targets to phase out gas-powered cars, and governments are offering incentives to push people toward EV adoption faster than ever. What does this mean for oil? Gasoline demand is already declining, and if this trend continues, oil companies will be forced to rethink their strategies or risk being left behind. If shale becomes unprofitable, the US may have no choice but to invest more in renewable energy or import oil again, putting the nation's energy future at risk. The perfect storm: inflation and recession risks. As oil prices rise, so does inflation. Everything from groceries to electricity gets more expensive. To stabilize the situation, the US has been selling oil from its strategic petroleum reserve. But that reserve is not bottomless. If inflation keeps rising, the Federal Reserve may be forced to hike interest rates, which could choke investments and slow economic growth. That could trigger a full-blown recession. Alaska's fragile connection and a brewing crisis. Now let's zoom in on a unique part of the US that's especially vulnerable in this unfolding trade storm: Alaska. Unlike the rest of the US, Alaska is geographically isolated. Everything from food and fuel to medicine is transported through a single route that runs through Canada. If that route is disrupted, even for a short time, it would cause immediate chaos. Remote towns like Haines, Skagway, and Hyder, which rely entirely on Canadian infrastructure, could face life-threatening shortages. The toll road controversy. British Columbia's move. A 1977 treaty between Canada and the US protects this critical supply route, the Alaska Highway, from tolls. But now, British Columbia Premier David Eby is considering tolls on newly developed infrastructure not covered under the treaty. This move could raise transportation costs by thousands of dollars per shipment, and those costs will land straight in the pockets of consumers. For a state like Alaska, where the cost of living is already high and winters are brutal, this could make basic necessities even harder to afford. Ripple effects across industries. But the fallout wouldn't stop at groceries or gas. Alaska's entire economy, from trucking to tourism, could be thrown into disarray. Cruise ships passing through the Inside Passage, which bring in millions of dollars in summer tourism, could face new environmental restrictions or fees. Cargo shipments might be delayed or rerouted. And air travel? Even Canadian airspace rights could come under threat, increasing costs and travel time for both passengers and freight. It's bigger than just Alaska. This isn't just about a remote state in the north. The entire U.S. supply chain could be disrupted by this new trade friction. And if a full-blown trade war erupts between the U.S. and Canada, the impacts will be felt across transportation, agriculture, energy, and everyday life. A trade war that hits home. When politics start hitting the highways, airways, and ports, the consequences are no longer theoretical. They're personal. From small towns in Alaska to consumers across the U.S., a bad policy decision or a deteriorating diplomatic relationship could throw everyday life into chaos. Because once the supply chain breaks down, no one is truly safe. And Alaska, for all its beauty and resilience, will be the first to feel the blow.